We always hear that for a business to succeed, you need a few key things, right? A ton of cash, a brilliant strategy, or maybe some game-changing new tech. But what if the single most important factor is something else entirely?
Well, according to Patrick Lencioni, author of The Five Dysfunctions of a Team, it's none of those things. He makes this incredible claim that the real ultimate competitive advantage, the one thing that's both ridiculously powerful and almost impossible to find, is teamwork. And that's the big idea we're going to unpack today.
So to really get why teamwork is so tricky, we're going to dive into a case study from Lencioni's book about a company he calls Decision Tech. Okay, just look at this. On one hand, you've got the public image of Decision Tech. A total Silicon Valley dream. They had everything: top-shelf investors, a roster of brilliant execs, a business plan that looked bulletproof. But behind closed doors, it was a nightmare. The company was basically rotting from the inside out. Deadlines were a joke, morale was in the toilet, and backstabbing was practically a competitive sport. The board finally had enough. They couldn't just ignore it anymore. So they did the classic corporate move. They fired the CEO, a guy named Jeff Shanley, and you could feel this collective sigh of relief across the whole company. But it was their next move that really made everyone's jaw drop.
So what was his grand solution?
Well, let's just say it was unexpected. They brought in someone that nobody saw coming.
Meet Catherine Peterson. By Silicon Valley standards, her resume was, well, it was just plain weird. 57 years old, already retired, and her background was totally old school, the military and car manufacturing. Her tech experience? Yeah, pretty much zero. Her MBA wasn't from some fancy Ivy League school, and every way you can imagine, she was a complete outsider.
Which, of course, begs the one question everyone was asking. Why in the world would they hire her?
It all came down to one thing. The chairman's logic was surprisingly simple. He knew her, and he knew she had this one almost magical skill. She had an amazing gift for building teams. That's it. That was the whole reason.
So Catherine takes the job. And what's her first big move? Nothing. Well, not exactly nothing. For 2 solid weeks, she just walks the halls, sits in on meetings, and she watches her new executive team.
And what she saw was bad. The meetings were just dead. There was no energy, no real debate, no passion. You could just feel this tension simmering under the surface. It was so obvious that everyone was just watching the clock, waiting to escape.
So let's meet the team, this cast of characters she was dealing with. First up, there's Mikey, the head of marketing. An absolute genius in her field, no doubt. But in meetings, she was a professional complainer, acting more like a critic in the stands than a player on the field.
Then you've got Martin, the founder and tech wizard. Intellectually, the guy was on another planet, but in reality, he was completely checked out. He'd spend whole meetings just glued to his laptop, only looking up to drop some sarcastic comment.
And of course, there's JR, the head of sales. He was the ultimate yes man, super agreeable, always smiling. The only problem? He almost never actually followed through on anything he promised.
And the rest of the staff was just as much of a mess. You still had the old, demoted CEO hanging around on the team. You had a chief operating officer with no actual operations to oversee. It was this collection of individual all-stars who were absolutely terrible at playing together.
Okay, so after 2 weeks of just watching, Catherine finally makes her move. And it wasn't some huge strategic announcement. It was simple, but it lit a fuse. She scheduled a series of 2-day off-site retreats up in Napa. And boy, did the pushback start immediately. Look at how fast this all went down. First, Martin, the tech guy, deliberately double books himself for the client meeting. Catherine confronts him face-to-face and tells him, nope, it's mandatory. Then, Jeff, the old CEO, tries to pull an end run and go behind her back to support Martin. It gets so messy that the chairman himself calls Catherine, worried she's just making things worse.
But Catherine's response to the chairman? It is a total masterclass in leadership. She gives him this incredible analogy. She says that fixing a broken team is like setting a bone that healed all wrong. You have to literally re-break it on purpose. And that process hurts a lot, but it's the only way for it to heal correctly.
Which brings us to the showdown in Napa. You can just feel the tension in that room, right? It must have been thick enough to cut with a knife.
Everybody is there by 8:45. Everybody, except Martin, of course, the guy who started all the drama. The clock is ticking, 8:50, 8:55, and then at 8:59, with 1 single minute to spare, he walks through the door. Game on.
Catherine doesn't waste a second. She kicks things off by putting her whole philosophy right on the table. She tells them, look, great teams aren't polite. They're honest. They aren't afraid to air their dirty laundry, all of it, because they trust each other enough not to be afraid of the fallout.
And that right there is the foundation she starts to build on. This whole story kind of holds a mirror up to our own work lives, doesn't it? It forces you to ask a really tough, maybe uncomfortable question. What's the dirty laundry that your team is afraid to talk about?